The end. The end had me gasping in horror, gasping for breath where she could not. But it was of no use. Every time I turn that page, the words roll out the same. Yes, she goes down all the same, trapped in Elijah's desperate, deranged arms on that little scuppered boat, disappearing beneath the chill waters of the estuary, hundreds of years ago. The water boiled up through the plug hole and the boat sank deeper. Life was beginning to return to Mehalah, but she neither saw nor knew aught. Her eyes were open and turned seaward, to the faraway horizon, and Elijah relaxed his hold one instant. "Elijah," she suddenly exclaimed, "how cold!" "Glory, glory, it is a fire. We are one." The bells pealed over the rolling sea. No boat was on it, only a sea mew skimming and crying. Yes, the end had me gasping in horror, gasping for breath where she could not. But it was of no use. Every time I turn that page, the words roll out the same. Yet. Sometimes the end is only the beginning. There are places in East Anglia that seem at the very end of all things, land barely grasping on at the edges of the tide line, only as tall and exactly as fragile as the flotsam the North Sea offers up and then redistributes. Places barely peeking up out of the water, blinking on the liquid horizon like the soft eyes of the seal. Speaking of seals, did you hear that they've returned to Orford Ness, home of the ancient wild man who returned to the sea? Yes. They have quietly taken back the shingle and settled enough to bring their pups into the world right there, in that gloriously sparse and weather-beaten place on the Suffolk shoreline. I wonder if the storm witch of Harwich spied their migration there, with a smile dancing on her lips while she scanned the line of the ocean passing. I'm sure she would have scowled when her far-reaching gaze noticed the seal shot dead in East Mersea, 2013. But the return of the creatures to the Ness after 2020 is a small victory for things being in the right place and order. Back to that ending, though. We find ourselves back in that fateful estuary on a stark summer morning, and there, lodged in the mud at low tide, a small scuttled boat, and the bloated body of Elijah Rebo. His arms rigidly locked, rigorously reaching out before him, as if attempting to hold on to something he couldn't grasp. And there, barely peeking up out of the water, blinking on the liquid horizon, a well-worn red jersey, caught languidly on a floating branch, draping and folding like discarded skin, emptied of the body which once inhabited its lovingly repaired seams and stitches. A grisly wedding present for George DeWitt and his new wife, Phoebe. Her eyes, slipping from shining like the midsummer sun to gently warming the winter frost developing on the faces of hungover revellers in the leather bottle, on the face of her new husband. But in the back of her mind too, the whispering realization that now, after all of the obligation, the passions, the pretending, now they would all be free. She could have no idea how free in the long run. And there, barely peeking up out of the water, blinking on the liquid horizon, a beautiful grey seal, calmly observing the community as it comprehended the loss which must have happened out on the water that night. She almost looked as if she was blinking tears back from her large, glossy eyes, a fire in them too, strangely familiar. Looking out over the water, George and Phoebe noticed the soft brown eyes and freckled face for a moment, hope rising in one chest, anxiety in another, both almost raising a hand to wave. But they soon realised the face was not human, and in an instant the seal slid cleanly beneath the skin of the water and was away. Still, a strange sense of comfort landed as a consequence of the brief sighting. The community rallied round to give old Mrs. Charland a good, honest burial, having discovered her laying cold beneath her cosy blankets at the Red House on the same morning as the grim discovery of Rebo and the boat. It was often uttered with sadness that poor Mehalah never left a body to lay down beside her mother in sight of Ray Island. But they didn't put it past her to have been as happy out there in the water in death as she had been in life. She was never rumoured to have risen as a restless spirit, returned, they supposed, to the wildness she clearly came from. And the Red House, well, that place was left to itself, left to rot like its deceased owner. Over time it tumbled down, but that place grew its own ghosts. A good 20 years after the drowning of Mehalah, almost to the very day, or at least so it's told, along the bar at the Rose. Almost to the very day, they say, 20 years later, strange voices could suddenly be heard floating up from the depths of the abandoned place. Some old childish lay rasped gleefully in an elderly voice, and answered by that of a small boy. Otherworldly singing drifting out over the water. The curious would be greeted by gruesome remains, birds pulled into torturous shapes and part consumed by something, which was enough to encourage them to put down their explorations of the old Red House and keep well away. And soon the way from the road to the ruin grew thick with brambles, and the shell of the place could only be seen from the water. It is told that sometimes eerie lights were spotted in the windows of the empty house, and eventually folk just navigated a wide berth around it, till it became a more than forgotten part of the world. So much so that I doubt, with the shifting of the estuary channels, the tangling of the wild plants and the crumbling of the blood-red bricks, that even the most intrepid local would be able to find it again. Yes, we must hope that it is completely lost. But I digress. Let us return to George and Phoebe. After a dramatic start to married life, they had settled well into a comfortable and cheerful groove. As keen as they had been to leave the island and carve out space elsewhere, the family that soon came along made them crave the salt air and the support of familiar people. So they had flowed back in like the tide and set up a good, quiet home, not too far from the water, but far enough from the rest of the village to feel like it was all their very own. 7 years passed, and the sorrow and anger George had felt about the loss of his first love was eroded away softly by this lovely little life. A deeper and more forgiving affection grew in his heart for Phoebe and for the golden boy they had brought into the world. Being so close to the water, they had made it a priority to teach him to swim, and now he was often to be found at the edge of the ocean. That beautiful boy had also developed a knack of caring for even the smallest creatures, and would comb the beach, acting as a protector of all the living things he found within his childhood domain. That spring, for the first time in a good while, there had been a few grey seals assembled along the shoreline at the bottom of their garden, seeking a safe place for their pups to arrive and grow. They had chosen well, and a particular mother and her pup took a shine to the DeWitt boy and stayed on into the summer, weeks after the others had gone. Indeed, sometimes, while working in the garden, Phoebe caught sight of the boy in the water, swimming joyfully alongside the pup while the seal mother also looked on. Her eyes were starting to play tricks because sometimes the pup seemed to look more like a dark-haired and giggling girl, but the long summer light plays tricks on the eyes, and so long as her boy was safe and happy, she would indulge this play. Soon, though, the winter and the wild began to call the seals, and away they had to go, leaving the golden-haired boy looking out into the darkening silver sea. To comfort him, they gifted him a small boat. From then on, he seemed to forget all about his playmate and spent many happy hours and then years learning from his father how to navigate it around the island, and then surpassing him in skill and going off on his own adventures. Another 7 years passed, and one bright spring morning, George and Phoebe were surprised at the breakfast table by their now teenaged son, excitedly reporting that he had heard the seals had returned to the area, this time making the salted shoreline of Ray Island their home. He was too filled with plans for sailing his little boat round to see them, that the hard looks on his parents' faces bypassed his attention, and he was out of the door again and already on his way. Not a word was uttered between George and his wife, and I suppose that may have remained the case had their son not bowled in after dark, well after his parents had become worried, and begun to describe with great enthusiasm the wonderful burnt little cottage on Ray Island, its hearth blackened but still intact. Had they known it was there? How wonderful to think that people had been lucky enough to live there. He couldn't believe folk had never spoken of the place. Perhaps he could camp out with the seals and get to know it as if it were his own. Phoebe's face had turned to stone, and she snapped at her son, forbidding him to return to the island. It was worth avoiding. It was unsafe. No good had ever come from folk being on Ray Island. His mother had never raised her voice so harshly to him. and the boy was stunned into a reverent compliance. But from then on, he seemed to lose something of himself, of that joyful curiosity and good temper that his parents so enjoyed. And then, one unseasonably stormy day in August, they caught him by the water at the end of the garden, shouting into the wind and waving to a lovely-looking seal with a glossy and unusual black coat. By some strange magic, she seemed to understand his cries and made a beeline for the beach. George and Phoebe watched in quiet amazement as their son and the seal sat together on the sand, watching the storm pass. They were always in awe of his kindness and humbled by the way that creatures could tell he was a safe harbour, and they hadn't seen him smile so broadly for weeks. So silently they retreated and left the boy to converse with his sweet companion. Thinking no harm would come now the weather had calmed, they thought nothing much of the fire that began to flicker on the beach, leaving him to camp on the shoreline during the warm and star-filled night, hoping it would help him back to himself a little. The next day brought with it the first morning chill of the long slide towards winter. Their boy appeared early, having clearly been for a swim and with a curious smile on his face. Some of the wonder of the world seemed to have found its way back into his eyes, and things returned very much to the way they had always been again. And so, time passed pleasantly for another 7 years, and the golden-haired boy became a man. He grew into his quiet, confident way of being, always keeping one eye on the sea and one foot in the water. His parents had perhaps hoped a career in the city for him, a fine townhouse and good clerical work. But the wildness of the island had crept under his skin, and he built a small fisherman's hut down at the bottom of their garden and took that on as his trade. Many of the girls on the island longed after him well into the night, but it was of no use. The golden-haired man only had time for the sea and for his parents, it seemed. If it weren't for the tight-knit of the community on that island, many of them would not even have known his name. To make things worse for them, that spring had been heavy with storms, and he had been the only person able to bring in a catch for weeks. His heroic capability to feed the island thus raised enough sighs of admiration from local folk. I'd not be surprised if they helped the world spin a little quicker. One late May day, he went out early in the morning under a low, dark sky into the billowing water, and George and Phoebe watched the trembling horizon for hours with anxious insides. As the day wore on and the light began to drop, they ran up island, raising an alarm in the Dog and Pheasant, in the Leather Bottle. They knocked on doors and windows, calling the community to help them search for their darling son, still out there in the violently dancing water. The dark followed them down to the beach, and despite all the folk on the island getting behind their boats, the storm played on, and they could not get their vessels out onto the water. It was hard to know if tears or sea spray had wetted their cheeks, and before long it became clear that they had no hope of launching their search. Just as that cold realization settled in their bellies, one of them spotted a warm speck of light blinking on the black horizon. The cry went up. "Look! Out toward Bradwell! A lantern!" And followed on with a ripple of relieved cheers and laughter. It made steady progress, darting like a firefly in a course set straight for the crowded beach. In the ink-dark night, it was not until the last few sturdy strokes of the oar that folk realised the skipper of the boat was not the golden-haired man they had expected. Indeed, he had been brought in unconscious, lying in the boat on top of a heaving silver catch, while a dark-haired, freckle-laden woman guided the small boat skillfully into land. Some of the older folk on the beach squinted their eyes towards her. So familiar her features seemed to be, but her eyes flashed brightly in a hue of sea green as she called for help to get both man and fish up out of the boat. The people gathered leapt to. Soon the catch was being cooked up, and the golden-haired man was warm in his own bed, with the dark-haired stranger nursing him diligently. The door to the hut remained barred to all except George and Phoebe for well over a week, and they had never had so many folk call upon them at home than in that short time, necks craning to peer down the garden and questions about who the stranger might be. George and Phoebe kept tight-lipped, but eventually folk decided that the girl was from over the water, on the other side of the estuary. Her resemblance to Mehalah was striking, but there were many maids with dark features abroad in these parts, and no way could they be related. And one who spends so much time at sea gets tanned by the wind and the salt in no time besides. Curiosity died down as the golden-haired man got back on his feet and, much to the disappointment of the local girls, took on his dark-haired rescuer to be his wife. They lived a happy and quiet life down there by the water, the woman a pillar of strength when the golden-haired man lost first George, his father, and then soon after his mother, Phoebe. As time dictates, we all must. They were inseparable at social events, keeping largely to themselves, but in a good-natured way. Day to day, they were often seen helping out the other quiet and needful members of the community, those who otherwise went unnoticed. To most, they were still a mystery, but well-loved nonetheless. Before long, they welcomed their own brood into the world, a gaggle of 7 gold and raven-haired children who always seemed to be giggling and splashing around in the water, just like their forebears. The size of this brood had pushed them to move into the DeWitt family home and take up all its rooms with their happiness. The golden-haired man often thought how his parents would have delighted at this sight if they were still around to see. But when the youngest child was still just a babe in arms, the dark-haired, freckle-laden woman began to sicken. She began to spend her days down in the fisherman's hut, her face always turned toward the sea. Then, one late May day, she took her golden-haired man to the side, and with a salt-streaked face, spoke the following words. "My darling love, I am sorry, but it is time. We always knew this day would come. I have stayed here with you this past 7 years and adored every moment. But I must return to the sea from whence I came. And this, our smallest child, my love, well, she must come with me." The pair held on to each other and to the babe like they would never let go of one another. but let go they must. The golden-haired man dipped into the cosy little hut and returned with a soft, silken, dark seal skin. Holding it out and watching his dear one wrap it around herself and seem to come alive again. This is the bargain that we made. I thank you, my love, for giving this gift so freely. I will care fiercely for our other children, and we will all watch the water for your return. And then he blinked back his tears and watched his two dear folk dip into the waves for long after they left the shore, before returning to the house. His life emptier, but his heart as good or better than his word. And he may have been the only one who knew that in the very moment Mehalah slipped beneath the water, trapped in Elijah Rebo's desperate arms. Her Selkie blood remembered its sealskin, and again she slipped away from him, leaving only her famed jumper behind. That she had watched in delight as her first and only love grew a family of his own, and then as her daughter grew fond of their son, the golden-haired boy, that she had passed in the joyful knowledge that those two dear children had found some happiness. And the rest is as written. And we could have left things there, but for one terrible twist of fate. For just as the DeWitt line had continued on, so had the Rebo line been passed down and returned to the area by Elijah's maltreated brother. The ghostly voices abroad on the water were not of spectral origin at all. The wretched and vengeful man had brought his own son home to the crumbling red house, and they had made their way there with as much violence and bitterness as the DeWitts had witnessed joy and comfort. That boy too became a man who wandered stealthy around the island, seeking game and other secret sustenance. This selfsame man harboured a congenital hatred not only of the golden-haired boy but also his Selkie wife. And this same man had been watching his blood-determined foe as they bid each other a tearful farewell. So, for all their lifetimes, a cycle began. The Selkie wife and the smallest child returned after 7 years, for another 7 years on the land, before returning to the water. In this way, they were able to share some sort of a life together as a family, and as they were wont to do, that family grew over time and grew and grew. The Selkie wife and the golden-haired man grew old and passed, both taking to the water together in the end. And their children had children, some of whom belonged more to the sea than the land, all of whom kept themselves well in wild places near the water, finding their time together as they could, and doing good in their local places as much as they had the chance to. They kept their secret, and things carried on just so for a century and a half or thereabouts. And the wild, angry man who watched went on to have his own wild, angry children who also watched. They kept their secret, and they watched, doing little else but harbouring their bitter blood for a century and a half or thereabouts. And then, in 2013, something shifted. The crack of a gun, and a feud finally concluding in another death. a descendant of Mehalah, shot through by one of Rebo. A murder, postponed until this heart-breaking moment in this small body washed up on a Mersea beach. It is told that on that morning that the seal was discovered shot through, and if you looked out over the water, barely peeking up out of it, blinking on the liquid horizon, were hundreds of soft eyes, looking almost like they were blinking back tears. And 7 years later, further up the coast, somewhere still wild and windswept and remote, a seal wandered up the shingle at Orford Ness. A golden-haired girl found shelter in a crumbling lighthouse, and this time nobody was there watching. The end used to have me gasping in horror, gasping for breath where she could not. But this time, we are turning a new page, and on it, we can write new words. Words that we need, words that roll out differently, words that catch dreams. And here, on the wild edge of the untamable salt shore, words that breathe easily.